The topic of tonight's panel discussion was decided in association with the Warwick Women in Economics Society, so they've clearly chosen a good topic. While I mention alumni, what's really fantastic is I'm not going to give the full introductions, but our three panellists this evening are all Warwick Economics alumni. And not only that, between them, they represent, bless you, the whole suite of programs that we offer in the department. So we have got graduates here with a BSc in economics, an MSc in economics, and PhDs in economics. So that's rather nice. So, if there is a fire alarm, then it's not an expected fire alarm. That means please remain calm and colleagues from the department will lead you out calmly from the building. So there will be time for questions, so be thinking of questions. There will be roving mics. There will be more drinks afterwards and opportunities to enjoy the view. So hope you'll have a really fantastic evening. But just before I finish, I will say, very importantly, I'd also like to welcome our chair this evening, Victoria Seabrook, who I'm sure a lot of you will recognise as the climate reporter for Sky News. So thank you so much for chairing this evening, Victoria. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Can you all hear me okay? Lovely. Yeah, I'm the climate reporter for Sky, so that means I cover anything from North Sea oil and gas policy, nuclear deal with the US, flooding in your back garden, or climate, well, hopefully not, or climate negotiations at COP. And this is, of course, timely for another reason, which is that all of this is so relevant and so much in the news at the moment. The energy transition is happening at a pace that was unthinkable even 5 years ago, and largely driven by what's going on in emerging economies. But that momentum is being hit. There are leaders trying to cancel the transition. I'm sure you can all think of a few. We've had the EU this week miss a deadline to come up with its new energy and climate plan at the UN. And also the reality hitting that this is hard. Some countries, they've done the easy bit of it, and now comes the hard part amid lots of heightened economic and security concerns. So we're going to talk about how serious some of these challenges are, what we can do about them, and how we can address them without exacerbating existing problems. And we know that women bear the brunt of climate change. They're more likely to not have enough to eat, to have to drop out of school, to die in natural hazards. And as resources become more scarce, they're more likely to have to work harder or walk further to get them. So it's excellent to be talking about these issues with this esteemed panel of Warwick Women, who I'm just going to introduce very briefly. We have Dr. Maureen Poole, who leads strategic and regulatory economics advice at Jacobs, which this year was rated #2 environmental and sustainability consulting firm in the world. And before that, she was chief economist at Ofgem, where she led its work through the energy crisis, delivering a £40 billion package of support. We have Professor Monica Giulietti, who has had an illustrious career in academia, spanning all the big names by the sounds of it: Loughborough, Cambridge, University of East Anglia, Warwick, of course, and is now Professor of Industrial Economics at Nottingham University. And she has many areas of expertise, but two of them are energy consumers' behaviour and, more recently, looking into fuel poverty. So lots of interesting things to get into. And then Dr. Amrita Sen, who is the founder and director of Market Intelligence at Energy Aspects, a global research house that advises over 500 companies on energy markets and geopolitics. She personally advises central bankers, CEOs, and energy ministers around the world. And as Caroline said, we will have lots of time for questions at the end, so please do get thinking now. But to start with, I actually just have a question for all of you in the audience. I just want to get a sense of who is here. So can I please have a show of hands? Who's a student here? Hands up, please. I know there's a few of you. Okay, lovely. Who's working in finance and banking? Okay, yeah, no surprise there. Policy? Yeah, energy? Okay, all right, have to make sure I don't make any mistakes. Regulation? Okay, academia? Anyone doing something completely different? Ah, okay, all true. Oh, we've got one. Okay, nice. What?
Yeah.
Sorry?
I belong to a forum for strategic studies.
Ah, okay.
It's wide-ranging. They could involve conflict,
Okay.
pollution, or
Okay.
military, or energy shortage, or water.
Great. All right. Well,
Source conflicts.
not, yeah, related, but most of you true to the cause, I can see. So I've got, first of all, one question that I want to put to each of you as a way of just sort of introducing some of your expertise. And what I'd like to know is, what do we not talk about enough when we're thinking about the energy transition and how difficult it is? What's being overlooked in your mind?
Sure. So when I listen to a lot of the news, particularly of late, the one thing I think we do not talk about enough is affordability. So we talk a lot about the megawatts, we talk about the market designs, but not enough, I feel, about the people who are paying. And I do think that we have to capture the hearts and minds of consumers in order for us to build that foundation for us to accelerate transition. When you look at it, I mean, the price cap is due to start, the new price cap is due to start on the 1st of October, and that has increased, right? And that brings affordability to the fore. And what we see is trust is so important in terms of ensuring you don't get policy reversal, you don't get that investor nervousness around the policy uncertainty. So for me, what we need to talk about more and not overlook is the importance of consumer confidence in investor confidence and in political stability. Because if these are not working together, the momentum will slow. So for me, that is the one thing I think we don't talk about enough.
My concern about the direction of the energy transition, I guess it's similar to Maureen's in a way, although in my work I have been focusing mainly on vulnerable consumers. So we're expecting that the energy transition will take place through the adoption of new technologies and also among households and consumers, and behavioral changes, becoming more efficient in our use of energy. But the recent energy crisis has highlighted that there is a group of vulnerable consumers who have found it really difficult to cope with the changes in prices that we've seen. And in particular, from my point of view, one issue that's not being addressed directly is the emerging levels of energy debt and arrears that make it difficult for a particularly vulnerable group of consumers to adapt to the changes that are required. And there is a question as to whether there will be parts of society that are left behind in the transition as these changes emerge.
I'm going to take what Maureen and Monica said and just extend it a little bit, because I've basically got two things I think that we don't tend to talk about. One is we tend to talk about energy transition as a very homogeneous concept, but energy transition is going to be very different depending on where you live. And we tend to have a very Western lens when we talk about energy transition, right? I find it problematic because I'm the BSc in economics, so I'm a very numbers-rooted person, the one here. I'll say this, that 15% of the world's population, which is US and Europe, consume 40% of the world's energy. And we are the ones who tend to dictate, oh, emerging markets should be doing this, etc. Right? When I'm having conversations with certain, let's say in Asia or in Africa, with whether it be energy ministers or companies there, I remember something the Nigerian minister said to me not that long ago, saying we are also transitioning, but from cow dung and firewood to oil and gas, right? And that was really eye-opening, because we tend to talk about, electric cars, etc., right? But there is a journey, and every country, depending on the stage of their economic growth, is going to be different. So we can't paint everyone with the same brush. We tend to do that. And that's why I feel it's quite a Western way of looking at it. And the second thing is the more geeky answer, which is, I think the thing we don't talk about enough is grids and grid stability and the investment required in grids. Like between now and 2040, I'd say we need to at least double about $600 billion in just grid investment to meet the climate goals, let alone the AI side of things, which is $3 to $4 trillion. And I've been literally just before this, I was talking to an energy major CEO who was saying he's got the likes of Mike Zuckerberg and obviously OpenAI and all these guys coming to him saying, we can't rely on the grid if we're going to have AI data centers. We need off-grid power. And therefore you go to the energy companies because they are the ones, because they run offshore facilities, LNG facilities, refineries, they know how to run off-grid power 95%, 100% of the time. This is going to be a huge problem for us because our politicians do not stand up there and tell us what is the true cost of energy transition. We'll all talk about, yes, we all want energy transition, and not a single one of us, by the way, has ever paid voluntarily for a sustainable aviation fuel. I don't know if you guys know, but in airline tickets these days, you basically have a tick box. This is the price of the ticket, and then you can tick for SAF, right? Do you want to pay for SAF? I was speaking to an airline CEO who said to me, he's been the CEO for 10 years. He said, since this has come about the last few years, not a single person voluntarily has actually paid for it because it's an additional cost. And our politicians will not get re-elected if they don't, if they tell us about that. And that's the problem.
And I wonder how much of that is a question of trust. And Maureen, we've seen sort of the fracturing of political consensus in the UK, the fading of elite political cues, and how might that be impacting consumer behaviour? And is there a trust issue? And what could possibly be done to address that? I
think there definitely is a trust issue, and it's an externality, so not many people are going to be rushing and saying, yeah, I'm going to pay for it. And there is always a desire to free ride, right? Somebody else pays for it. But I do think that consistency, a consistent message, and it goes all the way back to what we're seeing currently, where there are lots of reforms coming out. And they're great. They are really needed. But there's a question about how connected they are. And I have faith that they will get connected, and pieced together in the future. But currently, it's not clear. Not for investors, not even for policymakers. And therefore, for consumers to have confidence in a message that's very fragmented is difficult. So for me, the answer is the ability to tell consumers a story where they understand and they're willing to pay, and it is clear, it is trustworthy. Some of that will have to be from consumer bodies stepping into that space, because an ordinary consumer can't be expected to make sense of all that's happening in the landscape. But one thing is clear, if we are to pay for it, we need to be brought along the journey. And so therefore, a way has to be found to speak to us in a language that we understand and we can get behind and say, yes, we will pay.
I do wonder, though, whether the actual agent we're interacting with might matter. And as Amrita was talking, I was thinking, is there a question that consumers ask themselves, oh, I'm paying this money, is it actually going to be used for that purpose? And similarly, I would say, looking at consumer behavior in energy markets, there seems to be evidence that there's a lack of trust towards traditional suppliers. We did a piece of work on looking at participation in energy trading microgrid, and one piece of evidence that seemed to be quite robust was that one of the drivers is a desire to be independent from traditional suppliers. So this idea that consumer association, potentially local communities, might have to be the agent that we interact with, as opposed to more traditional suppliers or retailers.
And what's some of, can you paint a picture of some of the risk if we don't bring along vulnerable households? What's at stake for them and for the energy transition?
I would say in the first instance, there's a risk that the cost is not equally or fairly shared across different parts of society. If technology moves in a certain direction and there are consumers who, due to the fact that maybe they rent rather than own, or they have affordability debt issues, they can't take on the necessary technology. More generally, I think if flexibility and decentralized energy low carbon technologies are a condition for the transition, then it will not be available to all.
And Amrita, you talked a bit about blind spots of the global north, to put it mildly. What can those countries perhaps learn from some of the countries that you work with in the global south and the Middle East, albeit very different political systems, but are there lessons to be learnt there?
I think one of the lessons, which is, I find it weird even saying it, is that the case studies which are the successes, China, Middle East, it's trying to diversify away from oil and doing really, really well.
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia in particular. None of these are democracies. And that's really worrying, right? But I do worry that we've got a system where every 2 years we're worried about who's going to get elected, right? And then therefore, when oil prices are at $80, we talk about gasoline subsidies. And I'm like, that's not a high price. You need to subsidize the vulnerable households and then again, it needs to be means tested. I know it's complicated, but that's what it needs to be. But the lack of continuity in policy is one of the biggest challenges I find. Look at Trump. We had Biden come out with some massive pro kind of green policies. Trump overnight has reversed, I know we were not mentioning names, sorry. He's just completely overturned so many of the policies. It's happening in the UK as well. So from a private sector point of view, which company has the certainty, okay, we're going to invest, this is the return we're going to make, because there is zero continuity nowadays, especially in kind of big economies.
So what do you advise your clients then navigating this roller coaster?
Sorry, go for it first.
What I was going to say is you've made a great point there, that the politicians are thinking about their re-election, but who do they play to? And that's the consumer, right? And unless the consumer is informed, then it's easy to just get those policy reversals, these changes in policy. So that I think is a link that we cannot deny.
Yeah. I think to your question, if you look at the US just now, a wind project, offshore wind, it was 95% complete and it just got canned, right? I personally think what we should be, hopefully as consumers, kind of telling our politicians, at least let's come up with, it doesn't have to be a lot, but maybe 3 or 4 things that could be wind, whatever it is, it could be solar, it could be ammonia in ships. Let's choose whatever they end up being. Yes, governments will have to end up subsidizing certain bits of it, because this can't be just left to markets, right? Because this is not an efficient market to begin with. Eventually it will hopefully get there. but let's back the same technology so that the costs can come down. Right now, the volume, like we're talking about billions of dollars that are just being wasted. Every company, if you look at the majors, different companies are backing different things. One is the amount of green hydrogen projects that have just been cancelled is in the hundreds of billions right now. But this is just money being wasted. Fine when interest rates were low, but now they're not low either.
Yeah, and you mentioned Donald Trump waging war on wind turbines, and we've also had lots of political attacks on clean power in the UK as well. Is there any sign that this is actually impacting investment, that it's putting people off, and vice versa? Is this language impacting, drill baby drill? Are you picking up on any tangible impact of that as well?
I would say yes. I mean, where there is uncertainty, investors it will have a chilling effect on investment, because not knowing the policy direction is going to impact the certainty over revenue streams, the ability to forecast the economic model. So it will most certainly have an impact, and we're definitely seeing this.
But we're maybe also seeing it in consumers, I think, as you were saying earlier on, this subsidy for the adoption of heat pumps,
Yes.
which is quite substantial financially,
Yes.
but still consumers find it unaffordable and potentially also complex, difficult to understand. Again, I'd say the issue of trust. Who do I go to figure out what's best for me? And so beyond say strategic decisions by companies, on the side of consumers, there is also a need to understand that this needs to happen, and it needs to be embraced.
And why is this so hard? Because the rollout rates for some of this technology, like electric vehicles and heat pumps and so on, the rollout rates that are required are similar to things that we've seen in the past: mobile phones, fridges, internet connection. The private sector has a good track record of doing these kinds of things. Why is this so difficult?
Infrastructure. It's like we already have a set up system and we are trying to completely overhaul it, right? In some ways. I have an electric car. It's fine in London. Good luck when I try to go outside of London. The queues for charging are so insane just outside of London, because we just haven't kept up with that. And that's where the grid comes in as well. I mean, grid is just kind of in some ways an all-encompassing thing. I'm trying to say the infrastructure is the biggest issue. In Houston, which is, again, it's the center of drill baby drill, and I work with so many of these shale guys, there were, I'm not even joking, this is an actual real story, 3 electric cars on one street. They don't have many electric cars. 3 electric cars on one street, they happened to charge at the same time. The entire, not just that street, but 4 streets along just lost power. Wow. Houston's particularly, Texas is very bad for kind of grid stability. But I think that's the issue. We haven't done the problem has been in some ways the lack of working together. Car companies have come up because of government pressure to say, okay, we're not going to sell ICE vehicles beyond 2035, right? All of these things are happening, and the government said, okay, you can't sell X, Y, Z beyond this. But then nobody's actually spoken to, whether it be the electricity companies or whoever it is, to actually make the infrastructure keep up with it. And I think that's the biggest challenge. And that's also why, if you look at what China and now India are doing, very centralized. But that's the one thing I'll say, that yes, I do worry about the West in terms of where the pendulum is shifting. But the positives coming out of the East are pretty amazing. Like, I just got back from China about a month ago. And even my trip 6 months ago versus now, just the volume of more infrastructure I'm seeing. Now they have EV trucks on the roads there.
And so we've talked a lot about what other countries are getting right and how difficult it is here. So how can we boost private investment? How can we boost confidence at this critical moment?
Happy to go. One of the things we're asking on the point of infrastructure, one of the things we're asking investors to do is to build ahead of demand, right? So to get the grid ready ahead. So that is anticipating and investing before you know you actually have the return. So to get that confidence, that's a lot of confidence you need to give to invest way ahead of need. And the solution is the certainty, the political certainty, the policy certainty, the consumer confidence. They have to be there to motivate an investor, developer to build ahead of knowing whether they'll get the return. But also, which is something I'm seeing across the globe, the US, the UK, just across the globe, is about regulatory alignment, right? So we have loads of reforms. We have in the UK the strategic spatial energy plans. We have the grid reform, connections reform. So there's a lot going on. But quite how they're connected, how well they're joined up to give that certainty, that is a big question. So it has to also be about regulatory alignment and giving that certainty. And I think there are some studies out there, for instance, Deloitte and KPMG, that says that is the number one concern many companies have, is the regulatory certainty.
Yeah, and what about in the North Sea, where we've had different governments yo-yoing over extracting, not extracting, court cases, challenges, all sorts. I wonder if I can draw any of you on this. Is it deciding not to issue licenses for new oil and gas fields in the North Sea? The government says it's got to lead by example. It's a declining basin. I can see you shaking your head, but on the downside, you've got a loss to the of tax revenue and jobs. Monica, have you got any thoughts on this?
Well, I think we're seeing across the board a lack of clear path towards where we want to go. So aside from the North Sea oil, where I'm not very competent, but I would say we've seen intervention like the winter fuel payments that was a policy aimed at, say, making those pensioners who can afford to pay more for energy realize that energy is costly and you need to have a bill that reflects the actual cost of all that we're trying to do, the infrastructure, the expansion, strength, reinforcement of the grid. And then we go back to this idea that energy is somehow a God-given right, that we cannot ask people to pay more. We cannot ask people who use their petrol cars to go into work to pay more in order to address environmental targets and so on. So I think there is a general lack of clarity about being prepared to deal with the cost of what we are trying to achieve. I think it's been.
How honest do you want me to be about the North Sea?
Go for it.
I think it is a ludicrous policy for the simple reason that oil and gas globally isn't going away anytime soon, right? You've got emerging markets, be it Latin America, Asia, outside of China, Africa, still growing in double-digit rates when it comes to oil and gas. Are we not better off producing the oil and gas here? Put a carbon tax. And this is something we've been writing a lot about as well. I know a universal carbon tax is very difficult, but the UK has a carbon price, right? Capture the carbon. You're still going to be one of the greenest or the lowest lowest emitter in terms of emissions when you're producing that oil and gas. You sell that at a premium because it is actually going to be low carbon oil and gas, get the revenues. If you're not going to do it, as an example, Nigeria will continue to produce the oil and gas and flare. What's better for the world?
Well, the International Energy Agency says that no new oil and gas is compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So someone has to take the leap first, don't they? And they would say, well, by leaving this in the ground, it makes us better able when we go to international summits and so on to lobby other countries to do the same.
The problem is the IEA also just this week put out a note U-turning their oil and gas view and saying, yes, we had said don't invest. Well, now we need $550 billion every year just to hold production steady. Otherwise, again, demand's not falling, but supply is falling faster, and then the price goes up, right? So it's balancing that. That's the hardest bit.
Yeah, for a long time, the IEA was talking about forecasts of demand dropping, and then they said, oh, we need to think about supply. And I know that America has not been a great fan of what the IEA has been doing, so you can only wonder what conversations that they might have had as the US is its biggest funder. Monica, I was thinking about how might it be possible to move towards net zero and help vulnerable households at the same time? We talk a lot about them being left behind, but is there an opportunity for kind of, two birds, one stone?
I'd say short term, we probably need to think about the way we pay for, or we make people pay for their energy. There has been a lot of debate about the importance of the fixed component of the bill, and more generally about there's need for investment, there will be economic and social costs for this investment. How do we want to allocate it? There's a variety of complex elements in our energy bills where we pay for things that are not directly related to our consumption. So revisiting the way in which we are charged might be helpful in the short term. In the longer term, I think the key must be adoption or increases in energy efficiency, adoption of technologies, and
energy
that requires
efficiency is hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everyone's lots of countries struggle with that.
It's very hard, particularly in this country where there is a lot of work to be done. But with
why particularly here?
The housing,
Our old housing,
old houses, leaky houses, and particularly again amongst the most vulnerable, people who rent or people in more deprived areas of the country have have properties that are not conducive to energy efficiency. But yeah, again, there is this probably lack of information, lack of trust, lack of affordability that can be addressed over the medium to long term.
Yeah.
Because we know there are benefits to the transition beyond the just environmental benefits, and we need to try and engage everyone in the process.
And one of those benefits that was pledged by Labour during the election campaign was to save people £300 from their annual bills, although they've been a bit quieter about that recently. What's your take on that, Maureen?
Well, more accurately, it's £300 than it otherwise would have been. So there is that bit there. It is difficult, and we were talking earlier about trust, honesty. The cost of the upgrading the grid is going to rise, and that's a huge part of the fixed element, right? We can't escape from that. It might be the case that it depends on how we identify and help vulnerable consumers, some might see that reduction, but it's hard to envision where we are today, what we know needs to happen, and the cost involved, that we would see that order of magnitude. But I think we should certainly do something on vulnerable consumers. Identifying them is so far near impossible. I know you know that. But some focus needs to be placed on those who are least able to bear the cost. So something needs to happen.
The idea, it's not as compelling an idea to say your bills are cheaper than they would have been, as it is to say, look, your bills are cheaper than
Exactly, it's
than they
narratives,
were.
right? It's narrative.
But do you think it's doable before the next election that people will start to feel some benefit on their bills based on the current policy? Because that's going to be a real test for the government, isn't it? Amrita?
I mean, if I had that answer, I would be a millionaire.
I know, I was going to say.
I don't know.
If I had to bet, probably not. I genuinely do think globally energy transition is going to be one of the biggest inflationary pressures that we face, and especially with the whole, Russia, Ukraine, what's going on with the lack of cheap energy availability. And I just think we should be serious about that, right? Like, it is not going to be cheap. So I don't think so.
And just looking ahead, we've got the next COP climate summit coming up in Brazil in November, COP 30, back to where it all began with the Rio Earth Summit. What impact do COPs have? Do they provide some kind of certainty, direction, or are they losing their relevance? Amrita?
I can go only just to say that I think they used to be incredibly important. Over the last couple of years, it's just become a little bit more of a, the North versus the South and who's paying for what. A lot more finger pointing, I feel, the last few ones. I also wonder, and look, I completely appreciate that while there is an underlying acceptance, we're not going to hit 1.5. Maybe it's more like 2, 2.5. If we don't even aim for 1.5, then we might be at 5, right? Like, I get that. But I do wonder if COP should come out and just be like, okay, look where we are, because ultimately economic growth and energy poverty are two sides of the same coin, right? So we have to balance that. So yes, of course we can hit 1.5, but the whole world's going to be in a recession in some form. And maybe that's where it needs to play a new role.
Lots of difficult things coming up. Okay, I've just got one question for all of you to end on before we come to questions from the audience, so please get thinking. Just in a word, if you can, or I'll give you a few words maximum, but thinking about the energy trilemma, so this concept that we want to, we've got these three competing goals, that energy is going to be secure, sustainable, and affordable. How optimistic do you feel that we can solve that trilemma? Maureen?
It is solvable, and it's not really a trilemma. They should all work together, right? If we go to renewables and it's a cheaper source, then it should be more affordable, right? And it should provide greater security because we have more control. But in the short term, there's a big question as to whether they're working in the same direction.
I would say I agree with Maureen, and possibly that the focus of politicians now is very much on security. I think that's going to be the area that gets prioritized.
Yeah, one word answer is not, one phrase answer, not so hopeful in the current political climate.
Okay, I think we've got sort of a sliding scale here of answers there. All right, so please put your hand up if you've got a question, and in particular if you've got a question for Amrita, because she's going to have to head off shortly. Okay, let's take two over here. We've got two in the front row. We'll do you together.
Hi, Amrita. So you mentioned honesty to people, so politicians need to be open and clear about what is going to happen or what are the steps that need to be taken. And I agree with that, and maybe this is a very difficult question, but what's the content of that message? So what would you personally say to the people for them to agree, okay, we're going to have to pay more? I know I'm asking you to be a prime minister maybe, but what would you say to people, okay, you're going to have to pay more because of X, Y, Z?
I think the point almost is that let's not, I personally find, and when I have to deal with politicians as well, either it's the lack of knowledge of the energy sector that genuinely worries me. And then, you're basically saying things like, even right now in the UK, it's going on, there's a refinery that is potentially going to get shut down, and that will require, or that will lead to much higher petrol prices, right? But it's just being, again, it's the trust issue, because they're not building that trust and saying, look, these are the choices you're, ultimately, like in economics, but everything is a choice, right? And you're making that choice, saying, if you do close this refinery down, yes, it's extremely polluting, X, Y, Z, fine, but therefore this is going to be the price of petrol you will have to pay. Why? Because either we have to import, or there's only one refinery left in this country, whatever it is. That's never told, right? There's always then they suddenly start subsidizing, therefore nobody actually gets the true price. I think that's the point. Just tell us what it is, and then we can make the choice. Or then you can step in and subsidize as required.
And another one, I think, in the front row, yeah. Let's take two together. So if you ask your question, then we'll take another one. Go for it.
So I have a question about a bit touched on what Amrita was talking about, which is infrastructure, and specifically infrastructure in this country. I think what we're seeing, again, touching on what you've all said, is that there's a kind of desperate need for investment in green infrastructure in the United Kingdom, and we have this desperate need that's coupled with obviously a quite dire economic situation, very high levels of debt, high interest rates, like kind of governments unable to borrow more to fund investment in infrastructure. And so they're going for these kind of what I call cheap ways of getting growth. For example, building more runways at Heathrow and Gatwick, as opposed to cancelling projects such as Northern Railway, the Northern Leg of HS2, which is obviously something Rishi Sunak did, and the current government kind of continuing the delays with that. And that would unlock, as opposed to aviation, it would unlock a whole European railway system connecting to Europe, right? So it's this kind of choices the government has to make. It has to invest in green energy, but it doesn't have the means to. Do you think there should be a revival in how the government can fund this kind of infrastructure? Or is it something we just have to push further down the road? And how would the government fund it, given the current economic situation?
Okay, great, thank you. And there was another one there. Thank you.
Awesome. So I want to preface the question by saying that I've been a private investor in energy transition for the past 10 years now. And I think one of the most incredible things that we've seen is the decline in the cost of green power. So solar is now the cheapest way to produce power. Wind is the cheapest way to produce power. Why does it have to be that the consumers have to pay for this? We've done something incredible. We've made solar power the cheapest way to produce power. Amrita, I think you implied that there might be a hierarchy in terms of how the global south needs to transition. You're kind of saying we have to go to oil first and then go to green power. Green power is now the cheapest way. Why can't we just do solar panels everywhere? Why does there have to be that hierarchy, and why is oil the intermediary answer? Because I don't think it is. I think we're getting there in terms of affordability for a lot of these new green ways of producing power. So I don't know, maybe the tone of this conversation is negative, but I think there's lots of positives out there as well.
Interesting point. Okay, so we've got two questions. One on this sort of tension between prioritising green initiatives and also going for growth and build. And then also if green energy, if solar power is so cheap, for example, why are we not feeling those benefits? Maureen, I can see you scribbling down as well. So I think you perhaps could speak to some of those.
Sure. So on the first, right, it has to be public and private partnership, because the government can't fund all the investment that needs to happen. But what it can create is a strong basis for private investment to come in. So that's why, for instance, the government has Great British Energy, and one of the purpose is for it to help fund some of these projects. So and also you have recently Ofgem long duration energy storage cap and floor. Again, that is to encourage private investment. So the government has to work in partnership with private investors to actually fund the infrastructure that we need. And to your point, the infrastructure is a key part of having cheap energy, but we're transitioning to renewables, being on a system that was never really set up for renewables. And that is why you need the vast amount of investment for us to deal with a system, because the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. And when that's not happening, how do you ensure energy, you can still switch on your light? That has to, sorry? But precisely, but batteries had to come, and they can stand on their own 2 feet now, but batteries can't give you the long duration that you need. So you need to bring in, for instance, compressed air. You need to bring pump hydro on. There's loads that needs to happen. So whilst you have cheap energy, the infrastructure that needs to come on board to make it work until it can stand on its own 2 feet is vast. But we will see cheap energy, but it is a transition, and it needs a lot of investment to turn what was never meant for renewables into a system that works for renewables.
And I guess also a level of coordination about where different technologies go.
Precisely.
Where do you locate? What type of prices can you do?
Yes, yes. And that's why we have the strategic spatial energy plans. Yeah. They're not yet in place, but you wouldn't want pump hydro, I don't know, in the middle of London here. Exactly. So where do we locate some of this infrastructure is another big question. And even at the national level, you then think, yes, we can cite those big infrastructures in Wales, etc., but precisely where? Then you need to come down a level in terms of the local plans. So there is a lot, and that's why it's costly. Right, there's a lot going on.
And it's exactly that, it's intermittency. And I'm not saying it's oil, by the way. I think gas is really that intermediate fuel. That's going to be, it's not going to be oil. But yes, solar is the cheapest source of energy. How come your electricity bills haven't gone down in price? Because you and I don't pay for it. It might be the cheapest source of generation. It is not what we pay for it, because exactly when the wind doesn't blow, you still need gas as your base load. It's that base load energy. If we are genuinely seriously talking about energy transition, we need to get serious about nuclear. That's the answer, by the way, if you really want to lower the cost of energy for everybody, or electricity for everybody, because it's consistent, but it's that base load power. So effectively now what's happening is we're paying for double. We're paying for base load, which is, say, gas, and we are paying for intermittency, which is renewables. It will come down, but it's going to take time.
And nuclear is also being considered as a form of storage.
Yes, especially with fission and everything that's going on.
Loads following, more complex than the traditional nuclear production.
And have we got some questions over here for any of our panellists? You were very quick. And then in the bluey grey top over there, have we got some microphones over here? Oh, right, okay.
Cool. Thank you for the interesting discussion. Open question for the panel. It was mentioned earlier that certain regimes, such as in the Middle East and also in China, have performed quite well recently in terms of how they've been managing the energy transition. I'm interested in across democracies, but particularly in the UK, within a democratic system, what levers you think can be pulled to more effectively manage the transition if perhaps autocratic regimes are actually performing comparatively well?
Okay, and you, thank you.
Thank you for your interesting inputs. I was just wondering, we've been talking a lot about kind of different types of energy generation and kind of differences across the world, but we've not really touched on energy sobriety. And I think that's something that's maybe missing from the discussion, because as we know from the Jevons paradox, when we become more energy efficient, we just end up consuming more. And I think there's maybe more of a growing acknowledgement in the West that it's also maybe a problem of our own consumption. So I was just wondering what you think about that.
Okay, two quite provocative questions there. One about what can democracies learn from autocracies, and another about our human nature and if we're ever going to be willing to use less. Monica, do you want to take one of those to start with?
I'll consider the option of reducing our consumption. It is true that there is a rebound effect when you reduce the cost of energy, but that doesn't usually compensate for what you've lost. So it could be a more gradual approach if efficiency becomes more prevalent across different types of consumption, including industry, which is a big component of all of the things that we're discussing. And actually, in a sense, I guess industry is a bit also more concentrated than millions of consumers making their own decisions. Considering sobriety would have to be a change in mentality, and I would think that things are changing, and there's a lot more awareness about energy waste, and more consciousness about environmental damage. So over time, I hope that it might become a possibility, but at the moment, with society where a large number of consumers are pensioners, I think it's going to be a challenge.
Politicians are always quite wary of talking about behaviour change.
Yes, I think it has been thought of, right? So the National Energy System Operator, when it does the future energy scenario, one of its pathways, it considers that we can't get the behavioral change that we need. So a lot of it is about system transformation. It does have a scenario where there is major behavioral change to get to net zero, but it does consider the fact that we're not going to change, right? And we can't rely on that. I will give an economic answer to the question about democracy. So the social plan of the government isn't just concerned about energy security or just energy. It also is concerned about the whole host of things that we as citizens care about, and therefore it has to balance that. So it's not just one thing. And then it's the price or the value we pay on choice, right? So some societies may put a lower value on it than us in the UK, but that's not wrong. It's just the preferences of the various populations, but that's my economic answer.
And Rita, do you want to pick up? We touched on it a bit already, but we've got a very different political system. We could only
maybe we just agreed, regardless of which party is going to be in power, the energy policy doesn't change. We agree on that. But in jokes aside, I think if we're trying to go for net zero, which I think both agree on, again, it does go back to providing that certainty for the private sector, right? Like, how else can we convince the private sector to invest? If at least the governments understand that, sure, you can make changes around the edges, but at least if the core is about that, then it's just easier for continuity, right? I know it's easier said than done.
Okay, let's take some more questions. I don't know if you need to.
I've got 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, let's take gentleman over there. The one, yeah, great. Go for it.
Okay, well, taxation was mentioned. I wondered whether there is an economic process to tax the carbon-based energy so that it generates somehow resources to go green. I mean, this might be more a state-run effort, or maybe through taxing private companies, but I think that somehow we need to have an economic mechanism that uses the kind of lack of green energy in order to produce an eventual infrastructure, and certainly a power grid capability. Because even in this country, I mean, I don't think the grid capability is quite good enough at the moment, actually.
Thank you. Let's take another one here on the end. Just, yeah, grey trousers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask about AI. It was mentioned, and I think recently we had the CEO of NVIDIA say that the UK will have to build new gas power plants to power his data centres, which, that seems a little problematic to me. But I was just wondering, how should policymakers deal with the explosion in demand from AI?
Okay, so AI, that's something that governments around the world grappling with, and obviously nuclear's been in the news a lot as well. So, Amrita?
The AI, what NVIDIA said, and I think that not just in the UK, in the US as well, the biggest revolution you're seeing, in fact, goes back to, you mentioned drill, baby, drill. Right now, the entire drill, baby, drill has got nothing to do with oil. It's entirely gas because of this AI data center or the AI boom, right? It goes back to a related question. Renewables cannot give that baseload power, and just the volume of power that these AI data centers are going to be pulling in. Imagine giving all of us power, especially then if we start plugging in our electric cars, and on top of that, which is why the conversations I'm having these days are all of these guys are saying we need to be off-grid. So I think gas is going to be required.
Okay, it's not boding well for their case for sobriety over there. And we had another question about a mechanism, economic mechanism to pay for
carbon
some
tax,
carbon tax. And I wondered if you could also talk about carbon capture and storage, and who should be paying for that.
So on the carbon tax, we do have carbon tax in the UK and also Europe. And one of the things that is on the cards is to bring this together on the same level, so you get more consistency in behavior. So there is already a carbon tax, and I think it's not uncommon across the world to have carbon tax. I personally think storage is will help with the data centers. I really think if we can invest and get them on board. But to me, there is a huge commercialization gap in terms of the targets for storage and actually making it happen.
I think partly because the AI thing is so new. I don't think we've recalibrated any of the forecasts, right? That's the problem. Even 2 years ago, none of us had AI in
That's right. It's the speed at which it is happening completely.
And what about some of the different levies that we have on bills and the structuring of those?
Well, I guess given the financial situation in the UK, it's going to be a challenge to take it from anywhere. So traditionally, the choice is between putting it on the bill or financing through general taxation. And there's a perception that general taxation is more fair and equal. But there are still currently elements of social policy, environmental policy that are on our bill. I mean, the benefit of removing them, aside from the fairness side, is that there would be a clearer signal about the cost of what we use. And so as consumers, particularly if we introduce time of use tariffs, and we should be able to sort of make those relevant considerations about how much do I need to use, how much can I afford to use, and can I find a technological solution that will help me address this. At the moment, we're looking at prices that are relatively flat. It doesn't matter when I use my energy, and so we're not sensitized to the complexity of generating and using energy. So ideally, maybe a bit more of the costs, social and general economic costs, should go onto the income side, on income taxation, general taxation. I see it as a very unlikely decision at the moment, given the financial situation.
Been talked about for a long time, hasn't it? Have we got any more questions? Any women? Any Warwick women? Oh, yes, here we go.
Hi, I work for the EDF UK customers business, and affordability is a really big thing that we're talking about at the moment. So my question to you is, whose responsibility is it to identify and support those vulnerable customers, especially given the kind of political inconsistency we have at the
Okay,
moment?
great question. I think we'll take that as our final question. Maybe you could all just briefly give your thoughts on that, and we'll wrap up after.
So that is a brilliant question, and having worked at Ofgem, I do understand how difficult it is to identify Is it the regulator to address this issue? Is it the government? And sometimes the burden is put on the suppliers. It's not an easy one at all. But I think we need to very quickly get to a point where it's very clear who has responsibility. Otherwise, we end up with the huge debt. I think it's now 4-point-something billion, and nothing seems to change and get better. I mean, there is a question around identifying vulnerability so that you can better target the affordability question. But you ask a brilliant question that I'm not sure there is an answer to yet.
Yeah, I would say as suppliers, I guess, particularly looking at the issue of debt, at least you have that bit of information at the moment that might be relevant to address. And we hear that charities, consumer associations, citizen advice are indicating that they're having to take a lot of the burden of these activities. I'd say more generally, I wouldn't necessarily put the responsibility on suppliers, partly because the issue of trust that I was talking about, but also, and this is a more complicated thing to address, that you would need to know something about social care, welfare, so the WDP department should be more integrated with energy, with suppliers and so on. We should know something about the general economic conditions of the people that we are trying to target, and it would be unfair for suppliers to be able to investigate all of that. I would say that, like, on the continent, the systems are usually better integrated. I think in the UK there is a total separation between these elements. I think it's in Denmark where all of the information, financial and otherwise, of taxpayers is available in one location. So a better coordination about these, this type of information would certainly be helpful. Very long-term project.
They also always come up as one of the happiest countries, don't they? And they've got all that win, and they've got cardamom buns. They've got it all in Denmark. Amrita?
Again, phenomenal questions. Thanks for asking it, honestly, because it's making us think. I think from a responsibility point of view, it's got to be the government, because you can't expect the private sector to sort this out. But I think what you said is exactly right. The information on who's the hardest hit has to come from the private sector. To your point, Maureen, like when you're saying private and public sector need to work together, this is probably the most critical one, right? Yeah. The information sharing needs to be there, and then the government has to figure out, it's a welfare state, if there is a welfare state, how do you, whether it's via subsidies, whether it's taxing other segments and you redistribute the wealth, but absolutely has to be done. But it has to come from the central government, right? You can't expect private sector to do it.
Okay, well, thanks for all your questions. That was great. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but some of us will be, well, I hope lots of us will be around afterwards and we can continue the conversation. We've talked about what's missing, a lack of certainty, a lack of trust, a lack of clarity about what to do, confusion for consumers. We've talked about what we need, creating that certainty for the private sector, perhaps a lot more storage and nuclear by the sounds of it, and channeling our inner Denmark. We've talked about the commercialisation gap and the energy trilemma and the risk that that people are left behind, and the fact that people are being left behind now, but also the potential that these changes can benefit them, and some optimism that we will get there eventually, although it's a question of how quickly. So thanks everyone for that very interesting evening, and I hope that you will all join us afterwards, and please put your hands together for our excellent panel.